jacket on. I'm cold. I don't know about you, but I'm cold. It's early in the morning though, and I tend to be cold in the morning times. But that's okay. All right, we're going to do our heritage studies. We're going to start it out this week, and we're going to finish this chapter that we're in. We're in chapter 2. Remember last week we were talking about, we've gotten through the Civil War. Remember the war between the states? And we've been talking about rebuilding the nation. Remember we looked at the North and the South, and how the North was trying to make the South like the North, and the South was mad, and a new president came along because Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Remember, Congress had taken action. Then they had created the Freedmen's Bureau, and then they made some constitutional amendments that we talked about. Do you remember those things? So, what did the Freedmen's Bureau do? Do you happen to remember? If you can say it, I'll answer that, but I want you to try to say it first. What are some of the things the Freedmen's Bureau did? They enforced laws. They sent things to the needy people. They started schools. Remember that? They helped the treatment of black employers so that they wouldn't be slaves, but they would be employers. They would help anybody that had been hurt or had lost things due to the war. They made hospitals. They gave people land that had been abandoned. They did a lot of things. But what were the requirements for the southern states to add to their constitutions? They couldn't do anything unless they did this. What did they have to do? They had to make sure that they would let their laws had to be fair for the black people. Remember that? They had the right to vote, and they had to they had to put that in there. Do you remember which amendment that was that allowed I just gave you the answer, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery? I think it was the 15th Amendment that allowed the black people to vote. But here's you a note of FYI. Even though the 15th Amendment allowed black people to vote, these were only black men. Only black and white men were allowed to vote, because during this time, a woman was not even allowed to vote. Not until the 1900s could a woman vote. But we do vote now, and I just voted the other day because we were voting on constitutional amendments to the Texas Constitution, and I voted for those. So I always like to go vote. All right, let's look at page 40. What's the title of page 40? Did you say it out loud? Changes in daily life. So daily life, we're going to talk about the different things in daily life, and this first part is going to be about education, which is what you're doing right now. So we're going to read pages 40 to 44. And we're going to look at some of the different changes that took place, especially in the South during the Reconstruction period. Remember, this is just after, these were like the 12 years or so after the Civil War, and they were trying to put the states back together and have the Union be back together again. So let's go ahead and read. But remember, I told you you have to follow along with me as I read, okay? All right, Reconstruction brought much change to the South. Some changes lasted, some did not. However, during the Reconstruction years, life for most Southerners was very different from life before the war. One of the biggest changes was in the growth of education. Freedmen sent their children to schools. New colleges helped to educate black Americans. Churches restarted colleges that had closed during the Civil War. Now, before the Civil War, few slaves were allowed to learn to read or write. During Reconstruction, the children of freedmen began to receive an education. Throughout the South, thousands of schools opened. States began to pay for the public education as well. Most schools served either white or black children, and even though some white Southerners treated northern teachers badly, teaching continued. Freedmen wanted their children to receive an education, And parents gave what money they could to pay for the schools and the teachers. Look at that painting there on page 40. You see the caption underneath it? It says African American students at the Hampton Institute in Virginia. Do you see the teacher is a white teacher? And a lot of the children in there are black. So that's some of the changes that took place, because that had never taken place before in the South, before the war. See where it says colleges? Well, colleges at this time rarely permitted black students to attend. Because of this unjust treatment, colleges opened for black people in the South. That was something new. Look at the top of page 41. There's a picture up there. It says a mathematical geography class at the Hampton Institute in Virginia in 1899. And I think that's an actual picture. The other one on page 40 is a painting.
Don't let Quincy out till I'm way daylight.
All right, at the top of page 41, it says Christians realized that the freedmen's pastors needed to be well educated. So churches often paid to meet this need. These colleges educated leaders in religion and politics and other fields. And several of these colleges still exist today. And after the Civil War, white Southerners supported colleges too. Many students and teachers had died fighting the war. Some colleges had loaned their money to the Confederate government. And after the war, these colleges didn't have anything. Many religious groups gave money to colleges, and several new schools were founded. Almost all of them began as religious schools, because so many of the people during this time were, I don't like to use the word religious, but they saw the need for God to be in everyday life, education, as well as politics, and those not every person, of course, but a lot of people felt that way. And so that's why a lot of the schools were religious in nature. All right, do you see the bottom of page 41? There's a picture of a man there. His name is Daniel Payne. It says what, when, and where. Well, he was a bishop, a teacher, and an author, and he lived 1811 to 1893. In South Carolina. He was born a free black man, black American. He started a school when he was 18, but he had to close the school after laws wouldn't allow the teaching of reading and writing to black people. During the Civil War, Payne became the first black American to be the president of an American college. After the war, he worked hard to provide education and churches to the freedmen. He was dedicated to those people, wasn't he? It was terrible because during the war, and even before the war, people that owned slaves, many of them would not allow the slaves, the children, to be taught at all. Now, there were some that actually wanted them to and would teach them themselves, but that was very few. They thought that the thinking was that if a slave learned things like learned how to read and write, that they would realize that they had freedoms, or that they should have freedoms. And they didn't want them to think that. They didn't want them to have any kind of education. So it was hard on the black people. They had a real struggle, especially after the war, because people's minds did not change immediately. There were ways they did not change. Okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions from these pages just to make sure you understand. Now, so the freedmen, how did their children's lives change during this time? They were able to get what you're getting right now, an education. They were able to get an education. That's right. And how did some of the states make this possible? They started paying for the schools. That's right. Why do you think the freedmen were willing to put whatever little money they had into their children's education? Sometimes, the state didn't pay enough, or maybe the state didn't pay at all, and so the people had to pay themselves for their children to go to just regular school, not just college, but regular school. And money was hard to come by in those days, but whatever little money they had, they would scrimp and scrape to put their kids in school. Why do you think they did that? Why was that so important? They wanted them to have an education because they have an education and things are endless. They can read things, they can know things, they can understand things. Their self-esteem is better. So the next time that you want to complain about school, remember many, many times about 150 years ago or so, there were children who were begging to learn. And so here you and my children and all the other children that go to school, my children complain about school. And I have a sneaking suspicion that you might complain about it too. That's okay, because I complained about it too when I was in school. But now we know that we shouldn't, because there were people who really wanted to be educated and they could not be for some. All right. What did a lot of those new colleges have in common? Those new colleges that were started, what did they have in common? Most of them were religious. A lot of them were religious schools. That's right. All right, let's turn the page to page 42. We're going to kind of change our ways of, change our thinking from education. Now we're going to go to certain types of people. Remember, this is how the daily life changed. I have my cup of coffee. Do you have something to drink? All right, let's look at page 42. Do you see that picture of that bag? That bag is called a carpet bag. It's a bag with leather handles, and it's made out of carpet. It was very, very durable. So we're going to read about two funny names, a carpetbagger and a scalawag. We're going to learn what those two are. In fact, let's look in the back of our book in our glossary. Can you find the word carpetbagger? Let's look in the back in our glossary. Find carpetbagger. I don't think I have a glossary in mine. You might. I know you do. Well, I don't have a glossary in the back of my book, but I know you do. Can you look up the word carpetbagger in your glossary in the back of your book? Carpetbagger. Remember, when you look things up in a glossary, everything's in alphabetical order. So carpetbagger starts with a C, so it'll be in the C's. Did you find it? Can you read to me what a carpetbagger is? Can you look up scalawag? S-C-A-L. It's actually on page 42. You see the word there, scalawag. Look that up in your dictionary and see what it says in your glossary. Did you read what a scalawag is? A carpetbagger and a scalawag? Well, let's read page 42 and find out a little bit more about these carpetbaggers and scalawags. Northerners, remember you have to read along with me. Northerners moving south also changed Southern life. Many wanted to help rebuild the South. Some Northerners came as businessmen and others came to teach. Northerners often found the South unfriendly. People from the North thought Southerners should realize they had lost the war and accept that they were wrong. Northerners believed the South should be remade to make it more like the North. Most Southerners, though, disagreed. They knew they lost the war, but they did not admit that they were completely wrong. They often believed that God had let them lose to punish their sin, but very few thought slavery was their sin. They didn't like Northerners telling them that they were wrong. Northerners in the South had to find jobs. Southerners rarely wanted to work with them. Many Northerners tried to get government jobs. Southerners called these Northern men carpetbaggers. A carpetbag was a cheap suitcase. Southerners said the carpetbaggers were poor people from the North who went south because they couldn't find jobs up north. Before the Civil War, not all Southerners wanted to leave the Union. After the war, some of them worked with Northerners. Other Southerners called these Southerners scalawags. Scalawags and freedmen often voted for carpetbaggers to be in the government. Scalawags, freedmen, and carpetbaggers usually joined the Republican Party. During the Reconstruction, the Republicans controlled many southern states. Now, those carpetbags, like I said, they had handles on them, so they carried them like a suitcase kind of. They weren't all that big. They didn't hold much more. If you were to go get your pillowcase off of your pillow on your bed and put some, that's about how much it would hold. It didn't hold a whole lot of things, but they would put what they had in there and they would carry those bags. And a lot of times, not always, but sometimes those bags would roll out almost like a sleeping bag. And then when they were traveling, they would roll them out and take their stuff out. They'd sleep on them, and in the morning they would put all their stuff back onto their carpet bag, and they'd roll it up, click it, and carry it by the handle. And those were called carpet baggers. They were people from the north who came to the south to get jobs and to try to change the South. And the Southerners did not like, if you were called a carpetbagger, you were not very liked. And then a scalawag is going to be somebody that lived in the South that was that agreed with the North, and they had sentimental feelings toward the North. They weren't totally involved with what was going on in the South. So a scalawag would also be someone that would not be liked very well. So either one, a carpetbagger or a scalawag. But just remember, a carpetbagger came from the North. You can remember that because it starts with a C. Carpetbagger came from the North. A scalawag came from the South. So you can remember the sounds as to where they came from. Okay, but neither one of them were liked very much. So anyway, that tells us a little bit about that. Now let's look over at page 43. Not only did people themselves change, not only did education change, but even churches changed. Let's read on page 43 and see how churches changed. Churches also changed during the Reconstruction. Before the Civil War, most Southern churches had a mix of white and black people who attended. Enslaved people attended church with their masters, but black people had to sit in the back or up in balconies. At that time, most pastors were white. After the war, churches split into churches for either white or black people. These churches often split when people in them treated each other unequally. Freedmen wanted the situation in churches to change. Freedmen wanted their own black pastors. Freedmen wanted to be able to sit anywhere in church. White Southerners didn't want that change. They wanted churches to function just like they always had. Because of this, most freedmen began their own churches. They started many Baptist and Methodist churches. The freedmen's churches needed help. They usually had no land or buildings, and few black men had studied to become pastors, and few black men had studied, I'm reading the same one again. Few black men had studied to become pastors. Some Southern white churches gave land to the black churches. The Southern Methodists helped set up black Methodist churches. Some Northern churches sent money for land to the new black churches. These Northern churches also often sent missionaries and pastors. Later, Northern churches gave black men licenses to preach in their own churches. So, were all the people in the churches bad or mean? No. Now, if you're from the South, I'm from the South. I was born in Texas, and generally people, even today, people born in the South, they just love the South, and they're very sentimental to the South. And I'm very sentimental to the South, and I hate that the Civil War had to happen. A lot of times people in the South tend to think that only the South is good, and only the South this, and only the South that. And I love the South, and I'm happy, and I'm very proud that I'm from the South, and I am proud of the South, and I don't think the South was wrong in everything. I do think slavery was wrong, but I also think that it wasn't just in the South. There were things in the North that were going on as well, which we've talked about that before. This doesn't go much into detail about what was going on in the North. It kind of almost makes it sound like the North was good and the South was bad. And that wasn't all the way true. There were bad things that came out of the North just as well as from the South. But let me ask you this. Do you think that it was right for these churches to split and have a black church and a white church? Do you know what the Bible says about something like that? I don't know the exact scripture verse, but I do know, I believe it's in Ephesians. The Bible tells us that we should worship in all unity. That means if you are a Christian, no matter what color you are, you should worship together in unity in Christ Jesus, together, not split up because of the color of your skin. And we should never also judge someone based on just based on their skin color. That kind of thing happens quite often. Can you look at the last page of this section? It's page 44. Now look at this picture. It's kind of a weird picture. Is there anything that you noticed about that picture? I want you to look on page 44. This section is called Southern Society. Have you ever heard the word society? Look at it's bolded right there. It says a society is a group of people who live and work together and have similar cultures and beliefs. Now look at that picture, okay? Do you see that big word there in the break? It says segregation. Segregation. What's happening in that picture? Looks almost like an earthquake or something, doesn't it? Well, let's read and figure out why this is breaking into two and what that word means. By the end of Reconstruction, yes, it did come to an end, society in the South was splitting into two groups. A society is a group of people who live and work together and have similar cultures and beliefs. By now, few freedmen attended white churches. Both white and black Southerners claimed to be Christians, but the two communities rarely met together in church. White Southerners usually stayed in the Democratic Party. Freedmen joined the Republican Party. Even in schools, white and black Southerners were separated. So even though there were amendments to the Constitution to end slavery and to give the black man the ability to vote, the freedom to vote, what happened after this was the South began to split. And also, it doesn't mention in here, but even in the North, there was some segregation. Segregation is when a society splits into, generally because of skin color. It can be for different reasons. But now, they had churches and schools and even public places. Only black people could go here and only white people could go here. And so that's what happens in segregation. Okay, let's look at our worksheet, our work text page. We have one work text page to do today, and it's on page 20 in your work text. All we have to do today is fill in some bubbles, which should be pretty easy. At the top of it, let's pay attention to what the instructions tell us. It says mark all of the correct answers. A question may have more than one correct answer. Okay, so let's look at number one. What did Reconstruction bring to the South? Did it bring wealth for the freedmen? Did it bring growth of education or change? Do you remember? This was at the beginning of this section. It did not bring wealth for the freedmen. It did bring growth for education because remember, schools were popping up everywhere and colleges were popping up everywhere and people were sending teachers hither and yon. So it did. So you'll fill in growth of education. And it also brought change, didn't it? Change in lots of areas of people's lives. So you'll fill in growth of education and change. Now, I would like for you to finish the rest of this page. And I'd like for you to use your book. Now, read the question very, very carefully. You might have to read the question 2 or 3 different times and then go back and look in your book at the pages that we read if you're not sure to find the answers. It's okay to go back and reread a section. That's what's going to make it stick in your mind and help you remember. Okay? All right, so I'll probably grade this page as well. So go ahead and snap a picture of it and send it to me when you're done, and I'll get you a grade on that, okay? That's all for today.